All right. So this is my first screen recording run through with you guys. So the lesson that we were doing that you missed, or if you're trying to review for your notes, is on bias. And we're going to be taking a look at all the kinds of bias that might be useful to you on my quiz. In class, we talked about a few things. We talked about the Milgram experiment. If you remember that, Stanley Milgram was a psychologist, and one of the things he was testing was kind of like how control showed up in an experiment where he used a shock chair, or at least he told his patient he used a shock chair in another room, and he had a series of buttons. And the reason why we talked about the Milgram experiment was because the takeaway from that experiment for most people was, hey, people are sheep. They'll do whatever they're told if people in power tell them to do it. But it turns out that wasn't the case. It was actually a specific kind of bias that was at play here, and it was something called experimenter error, or experimenter bias. And this goes by other names too. The other names that we talked about in class that you might call experimenter bias are also selection bias, or, for that matter, sampling bias. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, this is like an overarching type of bias. It's the main idea bias that you're going to want to know. And it comes from this idea that a lot of times when experiments are going on, statisticians, studiers like us ourselves, want to, see a particular outcome come to fruition. So they tend to force things that they shouldn't. And what that does is it leads to results that are not actual. Okay, so what do we see for that? Well, there are three different kinds of experimenter bias / selection / sampling bias that I want you to feel comfortable with. And the most important thing here is that you understand why they work the way they do and how they function, not that you memorize the terms. So the big ones we covered in class were undercoverage bias, self-selection bias, and survivorship bias. Actually, I'll put bias after each of these. It was silly that I only put it after the last one. Okay, so what do these things mean? Well, luckily I can tell you. Undercoverage bias is when you don't interview enough of the right population when you do your study. So if I was, interviewing people about whether they love or they hate math class, this is a terrible example, but here you go. If I only interviewed math teachers, well, it would be probably quite likely that those math teachers would all love math classes. And so when I saw the results, the experimenter, might be like, see, most people love math classes. But of course, the problem with this is we aren't interviewing students. We aren't interviewing, people from all kinds of demographics and background. So undercoverage bias is a very specific kind of bias because it's anytime you have a situation where it matters the demographic that you are measuring, undercoverage bias could be a problem. If you need to be getting to certain groups of people, or if omitting certain groups of people causes a lot of struggle in your data, undercoverage bias might be a bias to worry about. The second one that you want to keep in mind is self-selection bias. This is one that we deal with all the time when we're doing surveys at school. And the reason why is self-selection bias is a bias that comes from the fact that people choose to be in your study. And if a person elects to be in your study, they're probably interested in what your study is about, right? I think the example I gave in most classes was if I was like obsessed with Skittles and I was walking down the hallway and I was offering a Skittles survey to people, most people would turn me down. But some students might be super passionate about the Skittles candy. I don't know why. But those would be the people who would be like, yeah, of course, Mr. Mays, I would love to take your Skittles survey. I serve it up. It's everything to me, right? And just by the fact that they've decided to take my survey, they're probably more interested in the material. And because they're more interested, their answers are skewed, okay? They're not a fair representation of the majority of people or of the public. So that's the way that self-selection bias shows up. You'll notice it's kind of similar, I should say, to undercoverage bias in some ways. The third kind of experimenter bias I want you to have in your head and in your notes is survivorship bias. We talked about this at the beginning of the school year. The survivorship bias one was related to the airplane. If you remember, let me see if I can get this right. There was an airplane I showed you. You can see my gorgeous drawing of an airplane here. I've always been quite a gifted artist, so I think we all know that was coming. This is my beautiful airplane that I'm drawing. And the way that the survivorship bias example I gave you guys at the start of the year went was there were areas where there were a lot of bullets, right? And then there were areas where there were fewer bullets. And the thing I asked you, I believe, was, oh, well, where should we put armor on this plane? And at first you would think, oh, let's put armor in the places where we see bullets. But it turns out that's not what we want to do. What we actually want to do is put armor in the places where there are not bullets, because those are the places that were hit where the plane did not come home to get measured. The plane arriving home, its survival, is actually a positive metric for us. So survivorship bias is anytime you look at results and your measured survey is only giving you the details for what you're looking for, and what you're looking for is too limited. There are other variables that are more important that actually give you the full story. So that's survivorship bias. Okay, you're halfway there. We are halfway through the notes that we did on bias. There is one more overarching category we need to learn about, though. We've done sampling / selection / experimenter bias. That's all one category. And you saw these 3 examples we gave. The second type of bias we're going to be playing with is known as response bias. And this category, I'm also going to give you 3 subcategories for. Response bias is kind of the other side of bias. So with sampling or selection bias, we were very worried about how experimenters can influence the results they're getting. With response bias, we're more interested in how certain questions can elicit bias in people, right? How are ways that the responses we get might be biased, and how can we cater our answers or our surveys to avoid that kind of bias? The first kind of response bias I want you guys to be comfortable with is what's called the halo bias, right? Or the halo effect. So as I said in class, halo, not the video game, but in case you were wondering, it's like the halo over an angel. If you can see, I'm drawing this beautiful angel. You can see with these wings. Boom. That's the kind of halo we're talking about. Halo bias or effect is when you have a very positive or a very negative view of something before you even start the survey. Okay? So before you've even begun the survey, you already have a predetermined view of the thing that you're talking about. The example I believe I gave for most people in class was that I actually love Nike. It's my favorite shoe brand. You can see my gorgeous Nike check here. And so I have a lot of positive thoughts about Nike. Right? Now, you may have a lot of negative thoughts about Nike. That would be a halo bias as well. But let's look at my example where I have a lot of positive views of Nike. I love their shoes. I love their clothes. I wear their stuff. Okay? Halo bias would be if I then was told by somebody, hey, here are all the problems with Nike. You know, they have sweatshops in other countries. They underpay some of their workers. They're not terribly ethical as a company. The fact that I would probably still purchase Nike clothes and Nike shoes, the fact that I still have a positive view of Nike, that's having to do with the halo bias or the halo effect, right? So this is when we bring in, as responders in a survey, positive or negative views that are not present in the survey. And so a lot of times when people vet surveys, they'll make sure that only certain kinds of people get to respond to them because some other groups might actually have a biased viewpoint. So, for example, if I were doing a Nike survey, I would avoid having Nike employees take my survey because they have a vested interest. They might have a positive or overly negative view of that company. So that's one kind of response bias. The second kind of response bias I want you to think about alongside the halo bias or halo effect is what's called the leading question bias. Now, what's the leading question bias? Well, as I said in class, it's exactly what it sounds like. A leading question. Think about in a courtroom, right? Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness. What does this mean? Well, the leading question bias is anytime you are offering a question in a survey or an option, and it is pulling people to answer a particular way. So a leading question might be a question where you go, do you think, this is an example I gave in one of my classes, do you think that the musician Drake, who has sold, so many popular albums and has made an enormous amount of money in America, do you think that this musician Drake is a positive role model. Or you could even go more generally. You could say, do you think Drake, who has made an enormous amount of money and has been very successful, is a gifted musician? And the reason this would be considered a leading question is you're deliberately giving me information that is supposed to paint Drake in a good light. I'm supposed to think positive things about him from the way you have phrased your question. Now, if this were not a biased question, you might just say, do you think Drake is a good musician? Or do you think Drake is a talented artist? Yes or no, why or why not? But this question, I deliberately put information about how successful he is in there, and that leads people to want to respond one way or another. That either leads them to want to respond positively, because they're like, oh, I didn't know Drake was successful. Yes, I agree with you. Or it may make you want to fight back against the question. Hey, forget you, man. Like, you think Drake is so great. I'm not going to go along with your leading question. I'm going to deliberately be more aggressive in saying Drake is not gifted because I'm right. Just kidding. Because the question was leading. Okay, so we have halo effect, we have leading question bias. The final kind of response bias I want you guys to have available to you in your notes and for you to be aware of is what's called the social desirability bias. And we went over this one months and months and months ago, I believe in every class, desirability bias. This one is wonderfully simple. We love the social desirability bias. What is the social desirability bias? Well, people are social creatures, okay? So the reality of the situation is that we want to be viewed positively by others, right? This is me doing my smiley face check mark thing. We want to be viewed positively by others. So if I said, in public, around a bunch of other people, hey, do you think murder is ever okay? You might be tentative to answer because you don't want people to think sad or bad things about you, right? That would be no good for you. What if you say the wrong thing and somebody thinks very ill of you for it? Even if you truly think that that thing is true, you might not want to say it. This also happens all the time when people talk about politics. This can be a big thing. Someone might ask you a very divisive means like it's a questionable or people have very strong opinions about it. Someone might ask you a divisive question about politics, and you would be like, I'm not answering that. Because if you answer it, it could lead to a big argument. Or you may just nod your head and say something nice like, oh, that makes sense. Right? So the social desirability bias is people not answering honestly, people answering dishonestly to avoid losing what we'll call social points. Right? You don't want your friends to think bad things about you. And the social desirability bias, we looked at an example in class using what's called a list survey. So this is something that you might want to have in your notes. A list survey or a list experiment. This is the final thing I'll go over. A list experiment is an experiment where you make a list of different things for people to agree with. And you might number them 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say there are 5 questions on the first list. And then you'll make another list. And that list is identical, but it only has the identical questions for 1 through 4. And what you would do is you would do really normal things. I'll put N for normal. You would put really normal questions for the first 4 survey questions. But then the 5th question, you would put an abnormal answer, right? You would put something that you think a lot of people wouldn't want to agree to. Right? Admitting that you do drugs or saying you think murder is okay or maybe just an unpopular opinion in general. Abuse is something that's often tested this way as well. And what you do in a list survey is you calculate the percentage of responses that are yes. So let's say 60%, when I average out everybody's answers of yes, 60% of, there was a 60% acceptance rate for the first list. And let's say for the other list, it was a 55% acceptance rate. Right? Now, mind you, when people filled out these lists, you can see how beautiful my writing is. Let me actually write that a little cuter for you guys. Now, I want to make something clear. When I say 60% or 55%, what I'm saying, here, I'll even do it in a blue color so it's more gorgeous. What I'm really saying is people didn't have to admit which questions they agreed with. They just had to admit how many they agreed with. And this is good because people are more likely to be honest because we've omitted or gotten rid of social desirability bias. People can't know which ones you agreed with. So these tend to be more accurate surveys. And what you would do in this case is you would actually subtract the percentage of people that said yes on list 2 that doesn't have the questionable question, from the percentage of people on list 1 who did have the questionable question. And overall, that percentage is the percentage of people who were most likely to say yes to this questionable question, if you will. So if like on the list survey we did in class, we're talking about drug use, that would mean that 5% of people agree to regularly using drugs. And that varies depending on what the question is. Now, anyway, this is a very long explanation for a really cool type of experiment that is used to work around or subvert social desirability bias. Okay, it's just one of the many ways we can work around it. But that is why social desirability bias is actually a really powerful bias. All right, I'm going to sneak one little secret bias in here. If you move back in your notes to leading question bias, there's a particular kind of bias that's sort of related to leading question bias. It's similar, and it's called anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is when a previous question or a previous fact in your survey, so I'll say previous fact or question. It's when a previous fact or question in your survey influences a later question or answers in a later question. So I'll say later responses. And actually, let's go down. I'm gonna curve this line and we're gonna follow it. You can see how roundabout my notes get, but this is kind of fun. We're going on a little journey together. Thank you for taking this journey with me. All right, so an example of anchoring bias in this case was the one I always like to talk about is the Gandhi example. So Gandhi was a very famous Indian statesman, and he fought for Indian revolution against the British. And Gandhi actually died at 78 years old. Okay, but the way the question goes is one group is given a survey that says, was Gandhi older or younger than 100 years old when he died? We'll do X. Yeah. That's what the first survey says. And then that's question 1 for the first survey. And the second question for that survey is, how old was Gandhi when he died? Okay. And then the second survey for different people is the first question, totally different. In this case, we say, was Gandhi older or younger than 39 when he died? I love my art here. And then the second question was the same question. How old do you think Gandhi was when he died? And what we see is, in survey 1, people tend to guess higher ages for Gandhi, ages that are closer to 100. Versus in survey 2, they tend to guess overall lower ages, or ages that are closer to 39 for Gandhi. And why is this the case? Well, it's because in one survey, we've been given a measurement. We've been given a point to think about. In this case, it's 100. So people tend to think, well, that's got to be significant somehow, right? So they tend to guess closer to that number. And the same thing in survey 2. They think, well, you said 39, that's got to be significant somehow. So it tends to influence the responses. So anchoring bias is that particular kind of bias where previous questions influence later questions in that way. Okay, that's all the stuff that we went over in class. We also did some activities where we tested out biases. The most important thing that I want to drill home for you is you can look up and learn other biases. I encourage it. Find some cool cognitive biases or statistical biases that interest you. There are a lot of them. But what I'm most interested in is, on my quiz and later on in your lives, I want you to be able to look at a study or a survey or a situation and go, oh, here are some of the problems with that survey or that study or that situation. Here are ways that you need to look out for bias that could creep its way in to these surveys. Because it will allow you to be a more critical thinker, and it will allow you the ability to understand what works and what doesn't, and why certain results look the way they do. All the time, the world is trying to pull the wool over our eyes, and it is our responsibility to remain critical, clever thinkers. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Thank you for learning about bias with me. Live the dream. This is Mr. Mays.